A man whose company, both in the sense of his physical, his presence and his company in the corporate sense, was sought after by all the leading financiers in the world. John Mack, Bob Rubin, everyone wanted to be Mr. Zhang's best friend, and I think probably still do. That certainly is a manifestation, I think, of a certain type of soft power. Ms. Catherine Kenny, who is the president and co-chief operating officer of the New York Stock Exchange Euronext group. This is the largest and most liquid exchange group in the world, and increasingly having a lot of interactions and discussions about how financial transactions can be worked out between NYSE, Euronext, and companies and investors in the Asian region. And then finally, Mr. Shah Zukang, the Under-Secretary General of the United Nations Department of Social and Economic Affairs. Mr. Shah is an expert on arms control and nuclear non-proliferation, among a variety of other issues. And as we were mentioning in our conversation a little bit before this meeting, he also is one of the people that we have to thank for bringing this event to Dalian. Worked very hard in organizing this event and bringing it to us here. So without further delay, let me just jump right into our discussion about...
Shall I go?
I skipped right over you. With slight further delay, Mr. Li Rogu, who is the head of the the Exim Bank of China, an institution that will be well known to all of you in finance. Sir Li was formerly the deputy governor of the People's Bank of China, where he was frequently gracious enough to receive many members of the foreign media and help them to understand the vagaries of Chinese macroeconomic statistics. So now, without further delay, let me, if I can, jump into our topic of soft power. Soft power is a concept that sort of entered the Davos global lexicon really about 4 years ago. My former professor Joe Nye helped to popularize this idea in his book that came out in 2004 entitled Soft Power. And the basic idea is that the subtle effects of culture and values, markets, media, these kind of soft cultural things can have in affecting the behavior of others. Power, as it's commonly defined, is the ability to get someone to do something you want them to do, but that perhaps they otherwise wouldn't. And Professor Nye, who I think we had initially hoped would be on this panel, but was not able to join us today, delineated three broad types of power: sticks, coercion, force, military might; carrots, the use of economic incentives, rewards, sanctions; and then finally, what he called co-optation. And this included both the power to persuade, but also more nebulous things like charisma, attraction, cultural appeal. What's interesting to me about this delineation is that it separates, it doesn't really regard economic incentives as being soft power per se. I think in the way that Professor Nye thinks about it, those are a sort of subcategory in a way of hard power. He's more interested in the more nebulous things, and I hope we can talk a little bit about that today. But anyway, soft power, the idea is that it's a third way. I think Professor Nye would be the first to argue that the United States over the last 5-6 years has lost a lot of its soft power. That it's a superpower still in a military sense, but that its global brand, if you will, has suffered badly in recent years. I guess one question for us today is to what extent China will be able to step up and fill that void that has been created. One of the basic elements of soft power is this ability to persuade, and the most simple elemental form of persuasion is just speech, interaction. So I'd like to start, maybe if I could, with a question about what I call the speech. I don't mean to be impolite here, but because I think all of us have really enjoyed our experience here at Dalian, but I must say, the speech that I heard last night from the premier is the speech that I have heard so many times before, and it's not much of a speech. I almost think that there's a a sort of laminated copy of this thing that circulates around the senior party leadership. And whenever they appear, it starts with the basic perfunctory welcome of the guests, the affirmation of the relationships, and then it goes into the sort of standard checklist, things that the party hopes to accomplish, the rhetorical buzzwords that need to be mentioned, whether it's peaceful rise or harmonious society or win-win situation. You can almost take a series of boxes and check them off as they go down. And then it gets to the part where it's the rehearsal of the GDP statistics. GDP up by X percent, exports up by so many figures, per capita income has risen by X amount. I've heard this speech given not only last night, I heard it from Wu Bangguo at the Boao meeting earlier this year. I heard it from President Hu Jintao at the Global Forum. And it, basically is the same speech. And it ends with this ringing declaration of China's prospects are bright. And everyone rises to applaud. But if you go around and poll people after the speech, the response is one of real disappointment. This, to me, is an example of soft power. 2,500 amazingly talented, bright, influential people, all assembled in Dalian. A huge PR opportunity for the leader of the world's fastest growing superpower. And all these people primed for a message. Instead of getting a message, what they get is the speech. I don't understand this. It's not that Wang Jiabao cannot give a great speech, because I've actually heard him do it. It's not that he can't be a good public performer. In Japan, earlier this year, he really charmed everyone in a very difficult political situation. He played baseball with a bunch of Japanese college baseball team. Who knew that the premier could actually throw a baseball? I didn't know. So let me start by putting Mr. Shah on the spot. Why can't Chinese leaders give a good speech? Well, this is an elemental part of soft power.
Can I speak in Chinese?
Sure, please.
Or English? Well, I think all the Chinese leaders are excellent speakers. I would claim that they speak better than anyone, at least certainly better than me. But I agree with you. Many of the things was said by the Premier are not very new. I agree with you. I try to anticipate what are the new elements there. So in that connection, I agree with you. But let me say, China has pursued the same kind of policies for many, many years. Since 1949, we have pursued the same policy, like a peaceful coexistence. But it's nothing new. We still emphasize that. So if China changes the policy every day, you can imagine what China will be looking like.
All right, well said, well said. Very good. Tom Friedman, let me turn next to you, if I could. You are one of the most highly valued speakers in the global lecture circuit. You are a speaker par excellence. You were the speechwriter for China's premier. What speech would you have written for him last night? What's the speech he should have given to captivate and exert soft power over his audience listening? Sounds like him. We hear him? Everyone? Is it coming through now? Yeah. Solve the problem.
Well, I'm a big believer that ultimately soft power is really a derivative of hard power. It's what you do with your hard power that defines your soft power. This isn't about a rebranding exercise of China. And I think that, what I would have loved to have heard, whether I couldn't have written the speech myself, I believe that, we are standing today in the world at the boundary between what I would call the post-Cold War world and the post-Cold War world. Now, the post-Cold War world has been a world which China has thrived in. Everything we see here in Dalian, China has thrived under the umbrella of the global integration, the advance of trade, globalization, and the stability of the post-Cold War world. I believe, though, we stand on the cusp of ending the post-Cold War world and entering into the post-Cold War world. And what is the boundary line between the two? I'll give you just one example, Clay. If Iran becomes a nuclear power, that's going to be the end of the post-Cold War world, I can assure you. Because if Iran goes nuclear, the rest of the Arab world in the Middle East is going to go nuclear. You have a nuclear Middle East, you're no longer in the stable, benign post-Cold War world. You're into the post-Cold War world. That's going to be a much more unstable environment for us in America and for China. So what I'd love to see from China is it to join us as the sentry of the post-Cold War world, as the guardian of the post-Cold War world. China's a free rider on the post-Cold War world. Right now, we are the ones dealing with the whole Iranian problem, but we've actually run out of bullets. We've sanctioned Iran as much as we can. The people who would really get Iran's attention, imagine if Wen Jiabao said yesterday, if Iran goes nuclear, in violation of United Nations resolutions, China will join the world in economic sanctions on Iran. Do you think that might get the attention of the Iranian leadership? Now that's an exercise of hard power that would improve China's soft power brand and make China one of the real guardians of the post-Cold War world, not a free rider and freeloader on the post-Cold War world.
Well, now that's a very interesting idea, and I think there are a lot of people that would agree with you that that's something that would certainly get the attention of the entire world very quickly, but it seems completely inconsistent with the style of Chinese leadership as we know it. Those messages tend to be communicated privately. They go through certain channels. They change often, I think. Do you think that in the post-Cold world, that style has to change, or can China exert its influence in a quieter, more kind of almost technocratic way?
I think at the end of the day, it is about the exercise of power. And I think what China, still is in this mode. I mean, I'm of that school in America. Maybe it's a small school. I want China to be a global player. I want China to join the United States as a guardian of the stability of the global economy and the global trading system. But that comes down to ultimately to real exercises of power, not blah, blah, blah speeches about harmony, etc. in the world. At the end of the day, Iran is either going to go nuclear or not go nuclear based on its calculation of power. And if China is sitting on the sidelines saying this is not our business, it will discover it is China's business. Because that instability will affect this economy. So I think it's about understanding that China now is a big global power, and I encourage it to join the United States in being a real guardian of the post-Cold War world, but this is nothing you can do by whispering. People in the Middle East, they can know how to calculate power at 100 paces. Okay, they can smell when you've got it and when you don't. Okay, and right now they sense that China just really doesn't want to play. And if you don't want to play, in the end, you will pay.
Mr. Lee, let me turn to you next, if I could, and ask thoughts on this point, and also perhaps about the obligations of Chinese business leaders and people in positions of financial authority to exert soft power. China now is an important market. It holds more treasury bills than any other foreign player. It's begun to invest in American hedge funds, for heck's sake. Those seem to be levers of some kind of power. Do you see them as such? And if so, how should China wield them?
I thought I should not be called because the moderator forgot to introduce me. I have the right to claim to be allowed to leave this room. But anyway, since I'm sitting here, so I would like to answer the questions. But please allow me to use Chinese because I cannot speak good English as the Deputy Secretary General of Mr. Shah, so I would prefer to use Chinese to make my point more sharp, more clear. 我想呢，中国的哲学啊，是你越想行使你的力量，你越不要行使你的力量。我不知道不知道是不是外国朋友能够理解中国这个哲学思想。有一句成语叫将欲取之，必先予之。因此我们相信，如果一件事情是正确的，它早晚有一天会破土而出，茁壮成长。我们不太相信外力可以使一个国家改变，而主要是内生的力量才能使它改变。因此在国际关系中，我们主张平等相处。中国还有一句话叫做“榜样的力量是无穷的”。那么也就是说，我们如果有比较成功的案例，他们就是其他的国家、其他的人民会愿意去学习研究。那么中国的所谓软实力，正好是体现在这种榜样的力量。那么发展中国家在过去几十年里，他们的经济，很多国家的经济不仅没有得到发展，反而是得到了破坏。而中国这个国家呢，却没有听从一些所谓的经济学的专家呀，和国际组织的一些建议，按照我们自己认为是符合中国国情和符合中国实际的道路去发展，而中国却获得了巨大的成功。正因为这一个成功，所以中国才有吸引力，所以才有其他国家愿意向中国学习发展的经验。所以我们认为，如果是一个成功的案例，如果是一个非常好的这个榜样，一定会用英文讲，说它早晚会 prevail。
All right, that's a great answer. Let me try to respond to that, though, a little bit and press you a little bit further, because I think the feeling now is that everyone in the world looks to China as an example of growth. And everyone would say that the Chinese model of gradual free market transition, as opposed to the shock therapy that was tried by the other major socialist regime, has proved to be the superior model. So everybody in the developing world, the emerging world, is looking to China. And I've heard this from leaders in Vietnam, from leaders in India. Everyone envies China for its growth. But I think part of my question is growth enough to be able to exercise leadership, moral leverage, to solve the sort of problems that Tom is talking about, to coalesce the international community? I think there is a perception, and let me know if you disagree with this, that perhaps some people feel now in the rest of the world that China is too focused on growth and not enough focused on other things, the environment, non-proliferation, other issues. So you said China needs to show by example. Other than growth, are there examples you can point to that China is leading the way, or could establish this kind of moral leadership?
我想中国现在所做的所有的事情，都是一种负责任的一种表现。比方说，中国是发展中国家对环境保护投入最大的国家。那这个 中国在过去10年里对环境的保护投入的资金上万亿人民币。那么除此之外，中国对其他的问题，比方说社会的平等、贫困群体的救助，现在中国的这个政府也好，民间团体也好，都对这些事情有非常高度的重视啊，做了很多很多事情。因为时间的关系，我不可能一一去列举这些事情。如果这个你有兴趣的话，你可以去查各个网站，都会这个非常清楚地列出来中国政府所做的这些事情。那么我刚才所解释的，之所以我不太同意这个 Friedman 先生的这个论点，就是你希望用强迫别人去接受某一种东西的时候，你往往是失败的，因为已经无数的例子已经证明了它是失败的。最近的一个例子就是伊拉克。美国已经够强大的了吧，但是他却不能够征服一个小小的伊拉克。美国在战前说伊拉克有大规模的杀伤性武器，最后 find nothing。就是在这样的情况下，伊拉克还是没有进入一个比较平稳的这个发展阶段。原因是什么呢？原因就是外力的这个强迫，不能使伊拉克走上一个比较和平发展的道路。我们更愿意用这个交谈、交流用这个我们认为是一种比较有效的方法去影响别人按照正确的道路去走。我觉得这个中国的哲学呢是有8000年的历史。应该说
Lee, I'm going to jump in here. I want to come back to this question of Iraq because I do think it's important, but I want to make sure that we get a chance to hear from some of our other panelists if we could. Catherine, you're from the U.S., now situated in Paris. You have a kind of a good vantage of how China's emerging leadership looks from both these key regions in the world. What do you see on this question? I mean, China's emerging leadership style, do you think it's fulfilling its potential as the world's fastest growing economy? Does it need to have a more aggressive kind of foreign policy stance as the sort that Tom suggested?
I'm going to just take a little diversion from the public policy stance and really focus on the private sector for a second, because I think it feeds the power image, but in a soft way. And what I mean by that is, over the last 2.5 years, we've had almost 16 companies list on the New York Stock Exchange. If you look at the size, scale, financial strength, but most importantly, look at the leadership of these companies. They're not well known in other parts of the world, but I would use one example. The CEO and chairman of the company happens to be in Dalian. Mandarin Medical. It's a company, multi-billion-dollar market cap, competes with Siemens and GE in the medical device space. But these are companies that are going to stand on a global stage. But these CEOs and these chairmen are ambassadors for this country and are going to build, I think, the kind of trust and confidence and power that will demonstrate what China really can do in the global economy.
Thank you. Let me pick up that thought and turn next to Mr. Zhang. You're one of those ambassadors for the Chinese corporate world. One of the things that we have this year in the Fortune Global 500 list, we have 22 Chinese companies on that list. They're almost all big state-owned companies of one sort or another. One of the things that strikes me as a journalist operating in Beijing is that the leaders of those companies are not very accessible to the foreign media. Put you on the spot here and ask you, when's the last time you sat down as a CEO of one of China's largest companies and had an extended conversation, not necessarily with Fortune magazine, but with anyone from the foreign financial press? And how often do you try to do that in the course of a year?
发展能接受这些国外的财经的媒体的采访呢？
刚才大家的发言都非常的有趣，我还想讲一点，如何真正的看待中国对待软实力这个问题的看法，是应该从几千年来中国的历史、文化、哲学中去寻找答案。其实如果讲软实力的话，全世界最古老的、最优秀的一本著作就在中国产生的。其实中国的儒家哲学、中国的《论语》，它全盘讲的都是软实力。大家可以看到，在500年前，世界上最强大的海军200多艘大船，它到了世界上去进行旅行，它送给它到达的各个国家的是礼物，而不是给予他们枪炮。所以我想呢，这就是中国的哲学。现在中国讲的和平发展、和平的和谐的世界，我想这是跟中国的哲学是有关系的。那么我讲讲作为一个私营的一个部门，软实力确实跟硬实力是分不开的。去年 ICBC 在成功的进行世界上最大的 IPO 220亿美金。以后我们又成功的经过我们的发展，现在成为世界上最大市值的银行，已经超过了 SHBC， 超过了 Citi， 而且成为全世界市值第3大的企业。但是呢，我们是很平静地看待这一切，因为我们知道一个企业的长久的发展不仅是靠它的硬实力，也要靠它的软实力，包括它的品牌、声誉、它的公司的治理，包括它的社会的责任。当然，作为一个上市公司，我们是经常频繁的跟各种媒体的接触。我自己每年大概不会少于100多次吧，跟各种媒体的接触，几百次的大概会跟全世界的各个金融机构和企业的接触。我们也通过这种广泛的接触，让世界来了解 ICBC。谢谢。
I just want to repeat my question, though. When's the last time you sat down and had an extended conversation with a member of the foreign press, and who was it?
这个就是在这2天，我也接触了很多的这个国际的媒体，像布隆伯格啊，像 FT 啊，像包括美联社。就是在昨天，我都接触了好几家媒体，也接受了他们的采访。
Fair enough. Fair enough. In fairness, I think I should say that there are some Chinese CEOs who are extremely accessible. We just did a large story about China Mobile, and your counterpart there, Mr. Wang, was absolutely fantastic and was delightful. But my feeling is that remains a little bit the exception rather than the rule, and it's to China's disadvantage, I find. Let's see if we can take some questions from the audience. I want to step down here if I can, and just kind of walk around and take the mic. Do we have a mic so that... Tom, is your mic working here?
Yeah, now it is.
Yeah. Let me take your... Tell us your name and your affiliation.
I'm a reporter from Xinhua News Agency. I will have a question for Mr. Fredman. I've read your famous book, and it said the world is flat. But do you think that only technology and information alone is enough to level the ground for all the global players? What about the other invisible hurdles? For example, the imbalance in the voice of poor and rich countries in the world. It's quite invisible here. You know, the microphone is in this gentleman's hand. My question is, you are simply the American people who better understand China than most other experts. And what do you think that the people necessary to understand the issue from the other side, not only from the American view?
That's a very good question. I just want to take up one point that was raised before and then go to that question that's related. Because the gentleman said, China exercises its influence really by setting a good example, and as you said, Clay, that example is in the area of economic growth, stable economic growth. And I couldn't agree with that more. I think China sets a tremendously important example in the developing world in particular of an economic model of growth. But soft power comes when you're ready to sacrifice a little growth for a principle. Okay, that's how you get soft power. Right now, let's use the example of Sudan. The United States has economic sanctions on Sudan. We are not buying or exploiting oil in Sudan. We are assuming a cost on us on the basis of a principle to uphold the principle at the UN that Sudan is engaged in genocide. Now, for a year, China has resisted sending UN troops to the Sudan because it's concerned about the oil supply from the Sudan for China. Lately, China has changed its position at the UN. That's a good thing. But it's precisely by being willing to sacrifice a little of that economic growth for a principle, the principle that genocide is intolerable, does China get the benefit of soft power. To your question, I would simply say that, of course, the world is not flat. The world is, though, flattening. Okay? That is the most important, I think, thing happening in the world today because of this diffusion of PCs, the internet, workflow software. If you just take a snapshot of China or India, for instance, I get this all the time. There's a book now out called The World is Not Flat, and there's a million essays. The world is not flat. No kidding. Thank you for telling me. Okay. All right. Of course, the world is not flat does not mean equal. It means equalizing. Okay. That this technological flattening phenomena is creating more opportunity for more people to plug and play, compete, connect, and collaborate than ever before. So when I look at China or India, but let's take Dalian. What is amazing to me about Dalian is not that there are no more poor people here. From when I came here in 1998 for the first time or 2002, what is amazing about Dalian is the scope, the scale of change. That's what you have to look at. If you just take a snapshot, no. Look at the speed and scope of change. That's the key metric.
Shah, you're the man to turn to for a reply on the point of Sudan, which I think knew was going to come up in this session. Can you address that, Tom's comment about China free-riding on oil in the Sudan and being dragged reluctantly to a more globally accepted position?
I have a couple of points. I know as a moderator you are deliberately provoking us.
No.
By posing all the nasty questions.
Shocked.
And firstly, I can understand first when we talk about soft power. Soft power, it's not a notion of Chinese, I understand. It's a notion created by the Western developed countries. If I stand to be corrected. The power implies it's always associated with the so-called powerful ones. And the powerful ones, it implies that I'm going here to empower you. So that's why, I have some strong views on that. And secondly, my colleague panelist said that China is taking free ride. Free ride. Ride for what? Don't forget, as far as I remember, China is the founding member of the United Nations, the Charter, and China is the active participant in elaboration, development, international regimes and rules. China working within that framework. When you say that China is kind of taking free ride, as if that we are benefiting something delivered by someone. This is a condescending approach. I think it's not very welcome. And thirdly, we talk about the guarding, so-called what somebody with the guarding the world, the leadership world, whatever. You know, we talk about the leadership is always related to leaders, and we are living in a democratic society. Leaders should be elected. It's not self-proclaimed. I think China, it has never been China's position as a Chinese diplomat, former diplomat I know. I think China does not want to be a leader. But certainly we have a lot of lessons, experience. If others wish to learn, we won't object, but certainly not the leadership. I believe it has always been the policy of China to treat each other as equals. It sounds like hypocritic, okay? It sounds clear, because I have lived in Western country for almost 30 years. I can understand that psychology, but it is not in conformity with China's culture to lead. We should not have leaders and the led. We are all equals. Talking about Sudan oil. Sudan, there is some misunderstanding or deliberate distortion of China's positions. As far as I know, I checked, because Sudan's oil was discovered by Chinese engineers many years ago. Sudan's oil industry and infrastructure were built by the Chinese, and that happened many years ago. China are there today because Sudan needs to sell and China needs it. So that's why. But now the impression created by media, perhaps, that China are there for oil only. That's wrong. It's the biggest lie I have ever heard. That I can tell you.
All right, let me get some other questions here. Your point about soft power being a myth of the strong countries perpetuated on weak countries. In fairness to Professor Nai, who kind of worked out this idea, I think he would argue that perhaps some of our friends here from India might argue that in fact weak countries can take advantage of soft power much more effectively than strong countries. I mean, if nothing, the lesson of Gandhi was that certain types of weakness can actually be turned to a moral strength by occupying the moral high ground. But let's see in the back here. Yes, can you get to him first? And tell us your name and your affiliation, if you could.
Yeah, my name is Rodrigo Maciam from the China-Brazil Business Council. It looks like that the Chinese policy, no interference policy, it's very convenient in terms of Chinese strategy to diversify its market, in order to export to other countries, except to United States and Europe. But my question is, when do you think, and this is for Professor Thomas Frieden, then when you see, do you see any time that maybe China will be forced to not think in terms of economic growth or markets for exports, and has to change its no interference policy? Do you see any case that this must be changed?
Professor Frieden.
Yeah, no, Professor. Thank you. I'm just happy to be a journalist. I think it's a very good question. I think about it a lot. The question of Iraq was raised, and right now, America is really hobbled and bleeding because of Iraq, and we haven't even seen the worst yet, I think. And as a result of Iraq, I would say that if I were to do a revisionist history of the last 10 years, it would look like this. America emerged from the Cold War with more economic and military might than any country in the history of the world, probably. And the rest of the world, I think, found that unsettling because there was no balancing power. And then for a lot of complicated reasons, we got involved in Iraq, and now a lot of that power has been dissipated in Iraq. What could emerge from the Iraq War, it's still too early to tell, is not a world with too much American power, but a world of too little American power. Now, if you didn't like a world with too much American power, wait till you see a world with too little American power. And it may be precisely in that context that China will be asked to, implored to, and forced to assume a different leadership style and position.
Any other Chinese panelists want to respond to that at all? No? Get questions here? Let's try over here. Yeah. Tell us your name and your affiliation, please.
Hi, Zachary Carabell, Fred Alger Management. Just a question about soft power or Chinese influence in the world, particularly in the developing world. You know, it would seem logical from the outside that many of the links that have been made, whether it's Venezuela or Bolivia or Zimbabwe or different parts of sub-Saharan Africa, Central Asia, that there's a kind of a filling in of the vacuum of areas that either the United States is economically uninterested in or politically antithetical to. So the question is this by happenstance or is this by purposeful strategy or some combination of the two?
Zach, who are you raising that to?
Anyone who cares to address it, which would seem to be nobody.
We'll pick somebody. And Mr. Shah, you want to try to tackle that?
Well, the vacuum, that means what? That means that there is a space which have been occupied all the traditional guys, you know, and therefore, if any, it's because of the weakening of whatever reasons of that particular power, there is some space. So the question I understand is that China will be coming to fill up the vacuum. But as far as I know, I don't think this notion has never come into the minds of my government. Well, as a former ambassador, let me say. So the argument of filling vacuum creates the impression that China is coming to lead, China is going to empower you. That is the very basis of this doctrine called China threat. So I don't like it.
But China's policy isn't just to sort of sit at home within its borders, right? I mean, it's very actively trying to expand overseas in all spheres.
There is only one thing I'm not extremely happy about my government policy. That is, you know, as far as China is concerned, China is a champion in advocating the South-South cooperation.
Right.
You know, this cooperation began ever since the very first day China was established. That explains why China's excellent relationship with Africa. Okay. Now, but China's South-South cooperation normally or basically takes the form of the bilateral modalities. Only in a couple of years ago that China began to have the collaboration with the regions like China African, China Arabic, like this. But China has never or very little used the United Nations as a kind of instrument to push or promote the cooperation with the other developing countries. As Under Secretary General, I'm not really happy about that. Thank you.
We've got, I think, time for a couple more questions quickly here. Let's give you a chance.
Thank you, Clay. My name is Pierre Kehat from Goodyear. I would like to offer a remark more than a question, and that is that China knows how to project soft power. And I'm thinking about North Korea. And once the U.S. has been willing to change its stance of North Korea and engage in dialogue, and China decided to get serious, things happen. So maybe there is a lot of hope for the future.
I'm Jimmy with CNN. If soft power can be encapsulated in one picture or icon or logo or concept, I'd like to ask the panelists, what in your mind constitutes or represents China's soft power now?
Want to pick a panelist for that?
Yao Ming.
This is Yao Ming. John, what's your thought?
如果让我回答这个问题，我就是中国是平等对待一切国家。正因为中国平等对待一切国家，中国是大概所有大国里唯一一个可以说我们的朋友遍天下。
John, do you want to add to that?
其实，如果我们看全世界各个报纸上的漫画，大家可以看出来，这个实际上民众已经给这个各个国家的软实力已经在画像了。
with summary statements here, because I know that there are still a lot of questions. So let's see if we can get one or two more, just very brief questions. There's one over on this side. Can we get him?
My name is Erez, I'm from Cardan Group, and I would like to follow up on Mr. Jiang's last comments and to ask Mr. Friedman if he invests a thought about the option that the way that the Western world define and implement soft power will be changed as China hard power will be increased and the definitions and the ways will be changed according to that.
That's a good question. That's a very good question. I think we don't know. I mean, if not today, very soon, for instance, Chinese will be the most popular language on the internet. It'll be the most searched language in Google. The real question I think maybe you're asking is, how much will the structure of the world as it exists now change China, and how much will a rising China change the world? But the notion that China treats all countries equally, well, that's wonderful. But all countries aren't equal. Sudan is not the equal of China. Sudan is a government that has perpetrated a genocide. Iran is a country that appears to be in rising violation of the UN resolutions on nuclear proliferation. So to say we treat all countries equal is a banality that, frankly, is not going to increase your soft power, it seems to me.
All right, we're going to take one last question, and then we're going to be out of time here. Who's? I'm missing people over on this side. All right, let's. Let me take a Chinese question here, if we could.
Hi, Chandler. You went to Harvard and Fair Banking Institute. So the question is, what do you see the difference between Friedman and you is exactly the difference between the Chinese version of Premier Wen's speech and the English translation of Premier Wen's speech. Yeah? And so you can see 温家宝总理他其实国学功力非常深，然后对人民很有感情。He really knows a lot of Chinese, and also he feels very much about people, and that's all lost in the English translation. And so my question is, for Freeman, American learning more about other countries' culture, how is this? What kind of progress has this been making?
That's a good question. So many, for instance, young people in America today are studying Chinese more than ever before. I meet, people who tell me now their 5 or 6 year old is, studying Chinese because people think that's the key to success now when you grow up. So, it's very. I just had a daughter graduated college, and I know a lot, therefore, about the current generation of Americans coming out of college. And they are very different from our generation, who maybe assumed a lot of things about the world and were rather lazy, frankly, about learning about the world and other cultures. I call the generation coming of age now the quiet Americans, but not in the Graham Greene sense, not in the 1960s, 70s sense of the arrogant American who goes abroad and just doesn't really care about the culture. Actually, if you look at college students coming out of college today, how many are studying abroad? How many are volunteering abroad? Before my daughter graduated, she had already taught in a school for untouchables in India, for instance. And that was my other daughter spent last summer living with a Muslim family in Senegal. These are things I couldn't imagine when I was their age. So there's a shift going on in our country. I'm much more optimistic about the generation coming up. They're not as noisy as our generation. They make a lot of their noise on the internet and Facebook and MySpace, places that you don't see on the streets. But, as Steve Trachtenberg, the president of George Washington University, said, these people, these young kids today, they find lepers around the world and they go read to them. And I have no idea where they find those lepers, but they do, and they read to them. So I'm optimistic about that generation.
That's a great question. Just if I could sort of add on a personal note, when I was an undergraduate at Harvard, one language that everybody wanted to know was Japanese, because it was in the headlines and it was growing like crazy. And next to the introductory economics course that was I guess taught then by Otto Exine, was the introductory Japan history, culture, and politics course called Rice Paddies. So I went back to the Fairbanks Center, I don't know, maybe 10, 15 years after that, and I was astonished. The Japan class had shriveled down to about 30 people, half of whom were Koreans. The faculty had to let go their Japanese language professor because only 2 people in all of Harvard signed up for first-year intensive Japanese. And so they just didn't offer it. Meanwhile, it was impossible to get into first-year intensive Mandarin. There were 120 students that were in, and there were another 200 students waiting in line. And I think one thing that I'm really struck with in Beijing is not just Americans, but people from all over the world now are descending on Beijing and trying to figure China out, trying to understand Chinese, trying to understand its institutions, trying to understand its companies. And I think you're going to really see these people now go out and do some interesting things. And that, in some ways, may be the ultimate test of Chinese soft power, not just how it's executed and implemented by China itself, but how it is refracted by these people that are kind of in the middle of the cultures, which I'm sure many people here are familiar with and know and are watching. I know there are a lot of other questions here. I think we're right out of time. I want to have you join me, please, in thanking our wonderful panelists and their very frank and candid responses on this great topic. Thanks to all of you. Thank you for coming.